So this cliffside mansion wasn't haunted by ghosts. It was being hunted by the living. Aria Vance hissed, her grip tightening on her Glock as the floorboards groaned under the weight of an invisible intruder. Aria bought the decaying Blackwood Manor for a mere $4,700, expecting a quiet recovery from her failed FBI case in Portland. But the whispers in the walls weren't memories, they were warnings. Before the truth is uncovered, subscribe to the channel and stay until the end. Comment below the city you're watching from so I can see how far our story travels. The iron key felt like a shard of ice in Aria's palm as she stared at the looming gables of Blackwood Manor. Behind her, the realtor, Richard Hale, practically ran back to his truck, the rain slicking his thinning hair to his forehead. "Don't call me after dark." "So, Agent Vance!" Hale shouted over the roar of the Pacific. "Everyone who stays here leaves within days. They say it's Mamo, haunted." "Houses don't scare me, Richard. People do," Aria replied, her voice steady despite the fatigue weighing on her steel-gray eyes. She watched his taillights vanish into the Oregon mist, leaving her alone with a house that seemed to be holding its breath. She pushed the gate open, the rusted iron screaming into the wind. Aria wasn't looking for a home. She was looking for a place to hide from the mistake in Portland that had cost a civilian his life. The FBI called it mandatory leave, but she knew it was a test of her shattered instincts. Inside, the air was heavy with salt and old wood. Aria swept her flashlight beam across the marble foyer, the light catching a chandelier that swayed without a draft. She froze. 2 amber points glowed back at her from the top of the grand staircase. Her hand moved toward her tactical jacket, fingers twitching for a weapon that was officially locked in her locker back at the bureau. "Easy," she murmured, her field agent training kicking in. "I'm not here to hurt you." The shape stepped into the light, a German shepherd, painfully thin, his black and tan fur matted by the rain. He didn't bark. He didn't growl. He simply stood like a living statue watching her with a judgment that felt uncomfortably human. "You've been guarding this place alone, haven't you, Shadow?" Aria asked. The dog, Shadow, lowered his head slightly. His ears pricked as a heavy thud echoed from the eastern wall. It wasn't the wind. It was 3 deliberate knocks. Shadow's hackles rose, his body angling toward the library door. "What is it, boy?" Aria whispered. Shadow didn't move toward her for affection. He moved toward the eastern corridor, his nails clicking sharply against the warped floorboards. He stopped at the library door and scratched, his posture rigid. Aria crouched beside him, examining the lock. "Cheap brass," she muttered, the professional analyst in her waking up. "This isn't an antique. Someone installed this recently." A faint chemical bite drifted through the air. Gasoline. Shadow let out a low, urgent whine, pressing his nose to the seam of the door. "Someone's using the haunted rumors to keep people away, Shadow," Aria realized, her steel-gray eyes narrowing. "They aren't ghosts. They're squatters." Suddenly the front door, which Aria had bolted, swung wide open. The freezing coastal rain sprayed into the foyer. "Sarah Mills." "Harbor Cafe?" A woman's voice called out. But her shadow against the wall looked far too large, too masculine. Aria ducked behind a pillar, her pulse thundering. "I'm not in the mood for neighbors, Sarah." "Just checking if you were still breathing," the voice replied. But Shadow was snarling now, a visceral sound that shook Aria's bones. Aria peeked around the column. The figure in the doorway wasn't a cafe owner. It was a tall man in a black raincoat, his face obscured by a respirator mask. In his hand, he held a jerry can that sloshed with the unmistakable sound of fuel. "The house is worth more empty than honest, Special Agent Vance," the man hissed, his voice distorted by the mask. "Shadow now!" Aria commanded. The German shepherd didn't hesitate. He launched himself across the foyer, a blur of fur and teeth. The man swore, swinging the jerry can as a weapon, but Shadow darted sideways, cutting off the exit. Aria lunged from behind the pillar, her tactical gloves gripping the man's wrist. "You picked the wrong week for a campfire." She twisted his arm, driving him into the marble floor with a force that knocked the respirator from his face. Shadow hovered inches from the man's throat, a low, controlled growl vibrating through the room. "Talk!" Aria barked, her knee pinned against his chest. "Who sent you?" "Portland. Shell companies," the man gasped, bloodshot eyes darting toward the library. "They want the coastline. This house, it messes up the land claim." Shadow's attention suddenly snapped back to the library. He ignored the man on the floor and began barking at the fireplace, his ears erect. "There's someone else here, isn't there?" Aria whispered. Before the man could answer, a pivot door behind the fireplace groaned open. A second figure emerged, holding a remote detonator. "Drop the agent or the whole cliff goes down," the second man screamed. Shadow lunged again, not at the man, but at the detonator in his hand. The device skidded across the floor toward the library. "Shadow, no!" The dog snapped the device up in his jaws and bolted toward the eastern corridor, leading the second man away from Aria. "You think a dog can stop this?" The man on the floor laughed weakly. Aria tightened her grip on the zip ties. "He's not a dog. He's the owner of this house. You're just the trash he's taking out." The cliffside house wasn't just a mansion anymore. It was a crime scene. Chitri and Shadow had just uncovered the first layer of a lie that went all the way back to the Portland case Aria thought she'd escaped. She looked toward the library where the gasoline smell was strongest. The real shock wasn't the gasoline. It was the map Shadow had uncovered beneath the floorboards, showing that Blackwood Manor sat directly on top of a federal munitions vault. Aria Vance realized her recovery leave was over. Her instincts weren't broken. They were just waiting for a partner who didn't need words to tell the truth. Would you trust a ghost story? Or would you follow the K9 into the dark? Shadow sat by the fireplace, his amber eyes reflecting the light like a promise. "Good work, gatekeeper," Aria murmured, resting her hand on his notched ear. "Let's see what else they're hiding in room 13. The darkness of Seacliffe Manor thickened as the second intruder vanished behind the hidden fireplace door, leaving Aria Vance with the masked man struggling on the marble floor. Aria tightened the zip ties around his wrists, her mind sharpening as the adrenaline of the Portland failure finally burned away. She glanced toward the eastern corridor where Shadow had disappeared with the detonator, a visceral fear for her new four-legged partner gripping her heart. "You can't protect this place forever, Agent," the man hissed through the pressure of Aria's knee on his chest. "That cellar is a tomb. Why do you think this house was so cheap?" Aria didn't answer. She stripped off his mask, revealing a scarred face and the eyes of a man with nothing left to lose. She dragged him to the staircase, locking him to the iron railing, and bolted toward the library, where the scent of gasoline was now overwhelming. She entered the room, her flashlight beam sweeping across rotting shelves until it stopped. Shadow was there, jaws clenched around the remote, but he was staring at the floor. Aria moved closer, prying up a loose floorboard to find a modern motion sensor pulsing with a faint red light. Don't move, Shadow, Aria whispered, cold sweat sliding down her spine. She realized the library floor was rigged with traps. Suddenly, the fireplace wall groaned open. Richard Hale, the realtor, stepped out, but the nervous man was gone, replaced by a cold killer holding a suppressed pistol. "I told you not to call after dark, Aria," Hale said calmly. Aria stood with her hands raised, realizing the ghost of Seacliffe was the very man who sold it to her. "Ghosts don't sign deeds, Richard," she countered. Hale sneered. "I just need room 13 to finish the claim. You messed that up." As Hale aimed at Shadow, the dog lunged, not at the man, but at a rotting bookcase. The massive structure collapsed, a rain of heavy books obscuring Hale's vision. A shot rang out, hitting only paper, as Aria tackled the realtor and disarmed him with clinical precision. "We did it, Shadow," she breathed, burying her face in his wet fur as the lights finally flickered back to life. But the victory was short-lived. A rapid beeping emerged from the tunnel behind the fireplace. Aria recognized the self-destruct sequence of a server room. "Run!" she screamed, dragging Hale toward the gate just as a thunderous explosion rocked the Astoria cliffs. The fire consumed 50 years of lies, lighting up the rainy night. Standing in the downpour, Aria Vance felt no regret for the house. She stroked Shadow's head, knowing that while Seacliffe had fallen, their mission together had only just begun. The ghost was gone, but the justice they sought was finally within reach. The orange flames of Seacliffe Manor reflected in Aria Vance's eyes as the explosion's echo died over the Pacific. She didn't look at Richard Hale, who lay shattered now that his room 13 was a smoking crater. Her hand remained locked on Shadow's neck, feeling the frantic beat of the German shepherd's heart. "You're okay, boy," she whispered, her voice a jagged tremor. The ghosts of her past in Portland were nothing compared to the living monsters she had just unmasked in the Oregon mist. "You don't understand," Hale rasped, coughing as the smell of gasoline filled the air. "That server room was the only thing keeping them away. You cut the head off a serpent that's been feeding on this coast for decades." Aria spun on him, her boots crunching on the wet gravel. "Then start naming names, Richard, because right now, you're the only one I have left to cuff." The first profound twist hit when a local patrol car finally screamed up the driveway. Sheriff Daniel Brooks stepped out, but he headed straight for Aria, his hand resting on his sidearm. Aria felt Shadow stiffen, his hackles rising in a visceral warning. "Agent Vance, step away from the suspect," Brooks said with a rehearsed gentleness. Shadow let out a controlled growl, his eyes fixed on the sheriff's boots tracked with the same fresh mud prints she had seen inside the manor's eastern corridor. The sheriff wasn't here to process the scene, he was here to clean it. "He's a witness to a federal conspiracy, Sheriff," Aria countered, her posture alert. Shadow barked once, sharp and urgent, turning toward the smoldering east wing. A figure emerged from the smoke. Sarah Mills, clutching a bundle of charred documents. "Aria, the tunnel! They're coming up through the cliffs!" The major twist slammed into focus. The server room explosion was a signal. The shell companies were already on site, using the storm as cover. Aria gripped the metal box she'd pulled from the floorboard, knowing the house hadn't been warning her to leave. It had been pleading with her to finish the story. "You exploited fear, Daniel," she said coldly to the sheriff. She stood on the cliff's edge as the ocean turned to dawn, knowing now that some ghosts only vanish when you're brave. The sirens of the arriving patrol cars were no longer a sound of rescue, but a herald of the final confrontation, as Aria Vance stood her ground on the wind-whipped cliffside. She felt Shadow's body press firmly against her leg, his low, vibrating growl a warning that the sheriff wasn't the only threat emerging from the mist. Sarah Mills scrambled toward them, her hands trembling as she clutched the charred ledgers that Richard Hale had tried to burn in room 13. "Aria, it's not just land," Sarah gasped, her eyes wide with a terror that bypassed the cold. "The records show the town's founding families were displaced by a shell company owned by Brooks's brother before the explosion. This house was the only evidence left of their theft." Sheriff Brooks didn't flinch, his hand tightening on his service weapon as he signaled his deputies to fan out around the smoldering ruins of Seacliffe Manor. "You should have stayed in Portland, Agent," Brooks said, his voice dropping the rehearsed gentleness for a flat, clinical coldness. "Some histories are better left buried under the salt." Aria didn't reach for a weapon she didn't have. She reached for the truth instead, holding the metal box high like a shield. "The truth doesn't stay buried when there's a witness who refuses to sleep, Daniel," she countered, her eyes locking onto his with the steel-gray intensity that had once made her the Bureau's best. A major twist shattered the standoff as the living ghosts emerged from the hidden cliffside passage. Men in tactical gear, faces obscured by respirators, to moving with a military precision that suggested they weren't just hired muscle. They didn't aim at Aria, they aimed at Brooks. "The deal was to keep the house empty, Sheriff," the lead masked man hissed, his voice mechanical and distorted. "You failed. Now we're cleaning the slate, starting with you." The cliffhanger of the moment left Brooks caught between the agent he tried to silence and the monsters he had invited in. Shadow didn't wait for a command. He launched himself into the fray, a blur of black and tan fur that targeted the lead gunman's wrist before the first shot could be fired. The chaos that followed was a blur of tactical movements and raw survival. Aria used the distraction to tackle the nearest deputy, disarming him with a precision that proved her instincts were far from broken. "Sarah, get the dog and get to the car!" she screamed over the roar of the ocean and the crack of gunfire. But Sarah didn't run. She grabbed a discarded heavy flashlight and swung it with a fury born of decades of suppressed town secrets. The profound twist came when the masked men were revealed to be members of the same private security firm involved in the Portland disaster that had sent Aria into recovery. The conspiracy wasn't local. It was a loop that had followed her across the state. "You were the target all along, Aria," Brooks shouted, his voice cracking as he realized he was just a pawn in a much larger game. The house was the lure to finish what they started in the city. Aria felt the floor of her reality shift. She hadn't bought a haunted house. She had walked into a curated kill zone. Shadow returned to her side, wanting his breathing heavy, his fur matted with mud and the metallic tang of the struggle. He didn't look at the men they had downed. He looked at the cliff's edge where a helicopter was beginning to crest the horizon, its spotlight blindingly bright against the dawn. "They're not here for the records anymore," Aria whispered, her hand resting on Shadow's notched ear. "They're here to erase the witnesses." The dramatic tension reached a breaking point as Brooks stood up, his badge reflecting the searchlight, and made a choice. He handed Aria his spare magazine. "Go," he said. "The town archives. The truth is in the tunnel." Aria and Shadow dived back into the fireplace passage just as the first rounds from the helicopter tore into the foyer. The darkness of the tunnel was a sanctuary they had mapped together, He took a labyrinth that only a woman and her canine could navigate in total blackout. "We have to reach room 13, Shadow," Aria urged, her voice a calm anchor in the narrow stone walls. "The backup server. If it's still active, we can upload the data before they level the manor." The final twist of the night was finding the archivist's body in the passage, the real Sarah Mills. The woman standing on the cliff wasn't the cafe owner. She was an undercover operative who had been guiding Aria from the start. "I'm not Sarah," the woman said, stepping into the red emergency light of the bunker, her honey-brown braid coming loose to reveal a headset. "I'm Bureau. We've been waiting for you to find the key, Agent Vance." Aria Vance looked at Shadow, then at the operative, realizing that the haunting was over. But the war for Atoria's soul was just beginning. "Would you like me to finish the story with the final part, revealing the ultimate restoration of Seacliffe Manor and Aria's return to the field?" The cold, damp air of the bunker stank of ozone and betrayal, but Aria didn't have time to process the fact that the woman she called Sarah was actually a federal plant. "You've been watching me drown in this house for 3 days?" Aria's voice was a jagged rasp, her eyes flashing with a fury that made the undercover operative flinch. Shadow let out a low, visceral growl, his amber eyes reflecting the red emergency lights of the passage. "We needed the land rights evidence, Aria, and only your psychological profile could push through the haunting to find it," the woman admitted, her hands already flying across the backup server's keyboard. The first mini-climax of the night arrived with the sound of a heavy boots slamming against the reinforced door of room 13. The living ghosts had found them. "Upload the data now," Aria commanded, stepping in front of the server to shield the operative, her hand tight on the grip of the magazine Brooks had given her. Shadow angled his body forward, muscles coiled and ready, his scars looking like pale lightning in the dim light. The door groaned under the pressure of a tactical ram, and Aria realized the conspiracy wasn't just about land. It was about erasing the analysts who knew how the private security firms manipulated federal cases. The major twist hit her as the monitor flickered to life, showing not just land deeds, but the actual surveillance footage from the Portland disaster. It hadn't been a misjudgment on Aria's part. Chuta, the civilian, had been executed by the same firm now banging on the door to ensure her silence. "The file is at 90%, the operative shouted over the thundering rhythm of the door. Aria fired a warning shot through the metal, the recoil a familiar grounding shock to her system. 95. Done! The computer screen went black just as the hinges of the door shattered. Aria and Shadow didn't retreat. They surged into the breach. Shadow was a blur of black and tan fury, disarming the first man before he could level his rifle, while Aria used the narrow passage to her advantage, taking down the second with a clinical efficiency that proved her instincts were not just recovered, they were evolved. They scrambled out of the tunnel and onto the cliffside just as the dawn began to bleed copper over the Pacific. So the helicopter that had been leveling the manor was now hovering low, its spotlight searching for the witnesses. "Brooks is down, but he's alive," the operative yelled, pointing toward the rust-stained pickup where the sheriff lay wounded. Aria felt a profound twist of irony. The man who tried to scare her off was now the only thing standing between her and a watery grave. She realized the manor wasn't a nightmare. It was a fortress that had protected the truth until she was strong enough to carry it. Suddenly, the helicopter tilted, its spotlight fixing on Aria and Shadow. A voice boomed over the loudspeaker, offering a deal, the records for their lives. Aria looked at Shadow, whose tail gave one measured, defiant sweep against the wet grass. She didn't negotiate. She reached into her tactical jacket and pulled out her phone, which finally showed a single bar of reception as the storm broke. She hit send, broadcasting the Portland footage and the Aria land deeds to every major news outlet and the FBI's Internal Affairs Bureau. The dramatic tension snapped as the helicopter began to bank away, realized the cleaning was now a public execution they couldn't win. The backup arrived 10 minutes later. Real federal agents, not masks or mimes. Aria stood on the steps of the mansion she had bought for a pittance, her hair escaping its tie, her boots caked in the mud of a conspiracy she had finally unraveled. She watched as the local deputies were cuffed alongside the private security team, their masks removed to reveal the mundane faces of men who had exploited fear for profit. The town of Aria seemed to exhale with her, the salt air finally smelling of peace instead of gasoline. The final major twist came a week later when the Bureau offered Aria her old desk back in Portland, with a promotion. She looked at the paperwork, then at Shadow, whose coat was filling out and gleaming under the Montana sun, where they had moved for a real recovery. "I'm ready," she told the voice on the line, "but the K9 comes with me as a full status partner." She had donated Seacliffe Manor to the town, turning the site of her terror into a community archive where the names of the displaced could finally be spoken aloud. Aria stood on the porch of her new beginning, the ocean turning copper below the cliffs, knowing that the whispers in the walls had been replaced by the steady, loyal breathing of a companion who never lied. She realized that miracles don't arrive in thunder, but in the choice to stand for truth when fear is screaming the loudest. She adjusted her jacket, the old fatigue replaced by a purpose that was no longer a burden, but a shield. Shadow leaned into her leg, a living perimeter that reminded her that some ghosts only vanish when you have the courage to name them. Aria Vance was no longer an agent on leave. She was a warrior who had found her home in the heart of the truth. Some histories become home when remembered, and some partners are worth every haunting you have to endure to find them.